Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Alert! Alert! Darkness Prevails has a brand new hardcover book coming out very soon on July 8th, 2025. And I need you to march your beautiful little booties on over to Amazon.com, look up Creepy Campfire Stories by Darkness Prevails, or click the link in the description, and pre-order right now, because I'm trying to reach 2,500 pre-orders before the release day. The book contains a horrifying collection of true outdoor-related horror stories, perfect to tell around the campfire. They're complete with eerie and atmospheric illustrations and images, and the book itself is a gorgeous hardcover that would be perfect on your bookshelf. And if you don't pre-order it, I'll put something else on your bookshelf. I don't know what that means, but I guess you could figure it out. Anyway, welcome back to Tales from the Break Room. I'm Darkness Prevails, your host and manager here at Dead and Roasted, and I'm just gonna get right into it, because today's stories are on a schedule. They're about horrific encounters by construction workers. There will be werewolf packs, serial killers, and a lonely ghost that would make Casper look like an alpha Chad who slays all the ghost Stacys. These are Tales from the Break Room. Surrounded by Werewolves, from Armando. I nearly had a breakdown watching that episode of Paranormal Witness back in 2013. I think that was the year. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I believe it was Season 3, Episode 9, The Wolf Pack, the one that showed a family trapped in their farmhouse by what they claimed was a pack of werewolves circling their property. Critics called it ridiculous, of course. But watching those recreated scenes of creatures stalking around the perimeter, those glowing eyes in the darkness, the family huddled inside wondering if they'd make it till morning. It hit a little too close. This is what happened to me and my crew on a construction site in northern Wisconsin, October of 1987. I was working as an assistant supervisor for a mid-sized outfit that specialized in commercial warehouses and industrial facilities. We would be working a contract to build some sort of distribution center for a regional supermarket chain on the outskirts of a small town. The location was ideal for the client's logistics. Right off the highway, but far enough from residential areas, they could still run 24-hour operations without noise complaints. For us, though, the site would soon become a nightmare. The property sat adjacent to a state forest, which stretched for miles to the north and west. Our section had been clear-cut decades earlier and used briefly as farmland before being abandoned. Nature had started to reclaim it. Patchy forest interspersed with open meadows of tall grass and scrub brush. The client had purchased about 40 acres, but we were only developing the 15 acres closest to the highway. The rest would remain untouched as a buffer zone. We had been on the site for about 6 weeks when this event happened. The foundation was complete. We were in the middle of erecting the steel framework for the 200,000 square foot facility. October had brought shorter days and a biting chill to the air. Most days we wrapped up around 5:30 p.m., but we'd fallen a bit behind schedule due to unforeseen circumstances, and the client was pressing us to catch up. Our project manager, who we referred to as Nikki, had authorized overtime, keeping the crew on site until about 9 p.m. for the entire week. On October 7th, I arrived for my shift at noon, relieving the morning crew. The day passed by uneventfully. It was typical construction work with the usual headaches, like materials being delivered to the wrong area, subcontractors arguing over workspace, all that crap. Around 6 p.m., the sky was starting to darken. We switched on the portable floodlights that illuminated our immediate work area. Beyond their glare, the surrounding land quickly disappeared into blackness. Most of my crew were young guys in their 20s, except for our crane operator, Delmont. He was in his 50s and had worked construction almost his entire adult life. There were 12 of us on the site that night, a smaller crew than during the day, but enough to keep making progress on the structural elements. Around 7:30 p.m., one of the younger workers, Vincent, came to me with an odd look on his face. "Hey, Armando? There's something out there, beyond the lights." I thought he was messing with me, but his expression was dead serious. I followed him to the eastern edge of the site, where he pointed into the darkness. "I keep seeing eyes reflecting in the distance, like animals watching us. But they're too high off the ground to be deer or coyotes." I stared out into that blackness, but I didn't really see anything. I then reminded him that we had spotted a black bear on the property a couple of weeks back, and I told him to stay within the lighted area. I figured that was the end of it. Within the hour, 3 more workers had reported similar sightings. Pairs of eyes reflecting our lights, always at the periphery of visibility, always disappearing when looked at directly. I still hadn't seen anything myself, and I was starting to get a bit irritated, to be honest. This just seemed like a distraction to me. At about 8:15 p.m., everything changed. The full moon had risen above the trees. Delmont had stepped down from his crane to stretch his legs when he suddenly froze up, staring past the floodlights into the meadow about 100 yards away. "Holy crap," I heard him whisper. I followed his gaze, and I felt my blood turn to ice. In the moonlight, I could clearly see 3 large figures moving through the tall grass. They were bulky things, covered in what looked like dark fur, moving around on all 4s. But there was something wrong with the way they moved, not quite like any normal animal. When one of them rose briefly into a bipedal stance to look in our direction, I heard Delmont curse under his breath. "God, those aren't bears." Word spread quickly among the crew. Everyone stopped working just to watch the shapes prowling at the edge of the darkness. I called Nicky then, who was back at the motel, but he thought we were yanking his chain and refused to come out. He ordered us to finish the schedule and to stop wasting time. Around 8:30 p.m., we heard the first howls. These deep, throaty howls that seemed to contain elements of both wolf and man vocalizations. They came from multiple directions, suggesting there were more creatures surrounding us than the 3 we could currently see. The men began to argue about what we should do. Now, our vehicles were parked in a gravel lot, which was about 200 yards from the worksite, in the opposite direction of the highway. To reach them, we'd have to cross an unlit stretch of ground, heading toward where we'd spotted at least one of the creatures. Delmont wanted to call the police, but several guys pointed out we'd sound insane reporting that we were encountering werewolves. Some said we should stay put until daylight. Others thought we should make a run for the vehicles while we still could. I tried my best to keep everyone calm, everyone focused on finishing the critical welding work, so we could all leave together at 9 p.m. as we had planned. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as 9 p.m. approached. The shapes continued to patrol the perimeter, sometimes disappearing into the trees only to re-emerge elsewhere. None had entered the floodlit area, though, which was a huge relief for all of us, I think. But they were definitely moving in a pattern that suggested they were watching us, assessing us. But why? At 8:50 p.m., we began shutting down equipment, preparing to leave. That's when Miguel, one of our welders, let out a shout that made everyone spin around. Standing at the very edge of the light, no more than 30 feet from our primary generator, was one of those things. In the harsh floodlight, its features were more visible than I wanted them to be. It stood at about 7 feet tall. It had a muscular, hairy body that seemed like a hybrid of man and wolf. Its snout was long, filled with teeth that were clearly visible even at that distance, and its eyes reflected the light with an amber glow. The creature remained motionless, staring at us with what I can only describe as intelligence. Then it dropped to all fours and loped back into the dark. Panic nearly erupted then. Two of the younger guys were ready to make a run for it, while others were grabbing tools as makeshift weapons. I managed to get everyone into the partly constructed office area, where we could safely talk without shouting over equipment noise. Listen to me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Those things have not come into the light. They could have rushed us already if they wanted to. I think they're territorial, not necessarily hunting us. They're between us and the cars, Armando, Vincent pointed out. How the heck are we going to get out of here? We debated some options. The creatures continued their patrol, occasionally visible in the moonlight, and occasionally announcing their presence with those chilling howls. By about 9:30 p.m., we made a decision. We would stay together, keep the floodlights on, and wait. Maybe the creatures would lose interest, or maybe they would move away from the parking area. Quite a bit of time passed in tense silence. We took turns watching the perimeter, while others tried to rest. None of us believed in werewolves, all right? Not really. But we couldn't deny that we were seeing something very bizarre. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe these were escaped exotic animals. Maybe they were people in costumes trying to scare us. Maybe it was a mass hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or maybe something in the air from a nearby chemical plant. None of the explanations fit what we were witnessing. At 11:15 p.m., we all jumped in unison when Delmont's radio crackled on. It was Nikki, checking why the generator was still running when we should have been long gone by now. When Delmont tried to explain what was happening, Nikki's response was predictably skeptical, but he seemed to sense some genuine fear in Delmont's voice. He said he would drive out to meet us. Now, we did our best to try to warn him away, telling him to just stay at his motel. But Nikki was stubborn and didn't believe in letting his crew face danger alone, even if he thought we were overreacting. 20 minutes later, we saw headlights approaching on the access road from the highway. Nikki's pickup truck. The creatures noticed too. We watched in horror as two of them broke from the tree line and moved toward the approaching vehicle. We all expected the worst to happen. Nikki's truck slowed as the figures crossed the access road ahead of him, clearly visible in his headlights. The truck stopped completely for about 30 seconds, then suddenly accelerated forward, horn blaring continuously. The creatures scattered as Nikki roared into the construction site, sliding to a stop inside our ring of floodlights. He leapt out of the truck, face ashen. "What in the world are those things?" he shouted, all his skepticism gone. With Nikki's arrival, the dynamic shifted. We now had a vehicle inside our safe zone, but it was not about to hold all 12 of us. After a brief discussion, we developed a plan. Nikki would drive his truck toward the parking lot, with the crew walking alongside, staying within the pool of light cast by his headlights and the portable work lights we could carry. We'd move as a tight group, make it to our vehicles, and get the heck out of Dodge. At midnight, we put our plan into action. Nikki's truck moved very slowly, with men flanking it on all sides, each holding whatever tool or piece of equipment might serve as a weapon. Delmont carried a portable floodlight powered by a battery pack, sweeping the light ahead of us. I walked at the rear of the group with a welding torch, watching our backs. We made it about halfway to the parking lot when I heard rustling in the tall grass just outside our circle of light. There was something pacing us. I called out a warning, and everyone bunched closer to the truck. Nikki stopped, and we deformed a defensive circle, all facing outward. The rustling continued, circling us, joined by similar sounds from multiple directions. "Feels like they're hurting us," Delmont muttered. "Like we're prey animals." For a long, terrible moment, we stood frozen in place, listening to the creatures moving around us in the dark. Then, without warning, one of them darted through the edge of our light, just a dark blur of movement, there and gone too quickly to react. A demonstration, perhaps, of how easily they could reach us if they chose. Miguel panicked and broke formation, running ahead toward the distant parking lot. Before any of us could stop him, he was 20 yards away, then 30, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he ran. We shouted for him to come back, certain we were about to witness his death. But nothing attacked him, thankfully. He made it to the halfway point to the parking lot unharmed, then slowed and stopped, realizing he was all alone in the dark. He just stood there, flashlight beam swinging from one direction to another in a panic. "Come back here," I called to him. "Don't run. Take it slow." Miguel began walking back towards us. And then I saw it. A massive shape detached from the shadow of a pile of lumber, moving on a parallel course to intercept Miguel. I yelled a warning. Miguel saw it too then, and froze. The creature stopped as well, watching him from only about 15 yards away. For an excruciating 30 seconds, man and beast remained motionless, locked in a standoff. Then, incredibly, the creature seemed to lose interest. It turned and loped away into the darkness. Miguel practically collapsed with relief, then resumed his careful return to our group. That strange encounter gave us all hope. Whatever these things were, while intimidating, they didn't seem intent on attacking us directly, at least for now. We resumed our slow procession toward the parking lot, maintaining our tight formation around Nikki's truck. Twice more we heard creatures rushing close, catching glimpses of those dark shapes just at the periphery of our light. But none of them breached our defensive circle. After what felt like ages, we reached the parking lot. The creatures remained visible at the edges of our light, watching as we quickly organized ourselves into carpools. No one would be left alone. We started our vehicles simultaneously, forming a convoy with headlights blazing. As we pulled away from the construction site, I looked back through my rear window. In the glow of the still running floodlights, I could see at least 5 large shapes moving into the previously forbidden area, investigating where we had been working before. They showed no interest in following us as we drove away. The next morning in daylight, Nikki and I returned to the site with a local sheriff's deputy. We found large, unusual footprints in the soft earth. These prints seemed to morph from wolf-like paws to something more humanoid. The deputy took photos but was clearly skeptical of our story. We pointed out areas where the tall grass had been trampled by something large, forming paths that no deer or known predator would create. The deputy suggested a small pack of wolves, maybe mixed with feral dogs. His explanation didn't account for what we saw, though, and yet we didn't push him on it. The project continued with expanded security measures. We installed more lights, brought guns, restricted work hours to daylight only. But nothing unusual happened for the remainder of the job, which we completed 3 months later. Most of the crew members never spoke of that night to outsiders. It became a sort of inside story, and when we discussed it together, we just referred to it as the night shift, with knowing looks. Years later, watching that Paranormal Witness episode, I realized I'd never truly processed what we'd encountered. I guess I'd buried it, rationalized it, and tried to forget. But those recreated scenes of creatures stalking around a lonely property brought it all rushing back to the surface. The fear, the disbelief, the understanding that I came very close to being prey to something that I could not comprehend. I've never been able to look at a full moon the same way, and when they do come around, as they always do, a bit of dread fills me, a sensation that I can't fully explain to those who weren't there with us, because they weren't the ones in a circle of failing light, hoping to survive the couple 100 yards to the parking lot. The Lonely Boy by the Lake, from C D Sawwz. I've seen things my whole life that other people don't see. Growing up, there was a man who walked the hallways of our house at night. No one else ever saw him, a tall figure in dark clothes who would appear at the end of the corridor, watching. My parents blamed an overactive imagination, but I knew what I saw. By the time I got into construction, I'd learned to keep these experiences to myself. No one wants to work with the guy who believes in ghosts. So when I got assigned as foreman at Lakewood Heights, a lakeside property about 30 miles outside of Portland, I didn't mention my sensitivity to the paranormal. 24 luxury homes arranged in a horseshoe around a small natural lake. The developer called it exclusive living in harmony with nature. They had no idea what was waiting for us there. I'd been assigned to this project from the beginning. Site preparation started in early March, and we were looking at a 2-year timeline to complete all the homes. The developer wanted to create a sense of exclusivity, marketing the community as a retreat from city life, with access to pristine nature. The lake was the crown jewel of the property. About 3 acres of clear water fed by an underground spring, surrounded by ancient trees the developer had fought to preserve. The marketing materials called it a serene oasis. In retrospect, maybe they should have checked the history of the place more thoroughly. The company I work for had landed the contract to build all 24 homes. It was a massive project that would keep us busy and profitable for at least 2 years. My crew was responsible for the first 6 houses on the eastern edge of the lake. We just finished pouring foundations and were starting to frame when I first noticed something unusual. It was late April, about 7 weeks into the job. The weather had finally turned, with clear skies replacing the constant drizzle of early spring. I was on site until sunset that day, checking the lumber deliveries and making sure everything was ready for the next morning. As I was loading my tools into my truck, something caught my eye across the lake. A small figure sitting on one of the wooden benches the landscapers had installed the previous week. From my distance, maybe a quarter mile across the water, it looked like a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old. Dark hair, wearing what appeared to be a light-colored shirt and dark pants or jeans. Nothing particularly strange about that, except that the property was fenced off and clearly marked as a construction zone. No one lived there yet, and the nearest existing homes were over a mile away. Plus, it was nearly 8 o'clock on a school night. I remember thinking it was odd but not alarming. Probably a kid from one of the nearby farms exploring the construction site. I even raised my hand to wave, but the figure remained motionless. I decided to drive around the lake to check on him, make sure he got home safely. It would have taken me about 10 minutes to circle the lake on the newly carved service road. When I pulled up to the bench, there was no one there. No footprints in the soft dirt surrounding it. No indication anyone had been sitting there just minutes before. I convinced myself I'd been mistaken, that the fading light and distance had played tricks on my vision. Maybe it had been a garbage bag left by one of the workers, or a shadow cast by the trees behind the bench. 2 days later, I saw him again. Same spot, same posture, same time of day as I was leaving. This time I grabbed my phone and took a picture, intending to show it to the security guard who patrolled the site at night. But when I looked at the photo, the bench was empty. I took 3 more in quick succession, but in each one, the bench appeared unoccupied, despite the fact that I could clearly see a small figure sitting there with my naked eye. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern continued. I'd see the boy on the bench almost every evening as I was leaving. Always in the same spot, always alone, always vanishing when I tried to approach or capture photographic evidence. None of the other workers mentioned seeing anything unusual, and I hesitated to bring it up. Construction sites attract a particular type of personality, and ghost stories aren't exactly welcome conversation among men who pride themselves on pragmatism and physical toughness. By mid-May, I'd tried telling myself that stress and the recent divorce were messing with my head. We were scrambling to catch up after timber delivery problems, and I'd been grinding through 12-hour days. I started bolting from the site before sunset, before that phantom child could materialize again. This escape plan worked for about a week, until the electrical contractor screwed up some wiring and forced me to stay late. As I was leaving, I kept my eyes locked on my truck, fighting the urge to look toward that bench. But something pulled my gaze there anyway, like a magnet. The boy sat there, rigid and unnatural, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside the bench, her hand resting on its back. From that distance, I could make out a slim figure with shoulder-length hair, wearing what looked like a dress that rippled wrong in the breeze, as if it moved on its own. My skin prickled. Something about the woman's posture seemed possessive, controlling. The way she stood behind the boy didn't look protective. It looked predatory. The hairs on my arms stood up as I watched them, these impossible figures that shouldn't exist. I started my truck with shaking hands and peeled out, taking the long way home to avoid passing anywhere near that bench. That weekend, I couldn't shake the image of that woman standing over the boy. I drove to the site at dawn, checking every inch of fencing, searching for any way trespassers could slip in. I inspected the security system, reviewed camera footage, and tested the motion sensors myself. The place was locked down tight. Dense forest surrounded 3 sides, with a single gated road monitored 24/7. The security logs were clean except for wildlife triggers. No human could have entered without leaving evidence. I tracked down some old-timers at the local diner, fishing for information while pretending to discuss construction logistics. Several opposed our project, claiming we were disturbing things best left alone. When I pressed for specifics, they'd clam up or change the subject. One elderly waitress just shook her head and walked away when I mentioned seeing a woman and child near the lake. I called a buddy who worked for the county records office. He owed me for helping with his basement remodel, so he dug around after hours. The property history was unremarkable. Farmland until the 50s, then lumber company land. But he found something odd. The surveyor's report from when the developers purchased the land noted an anomalous ground depression near the northeast shore that did not match natural geological formations. The developers had simply filled it in before construction. By early June, the sighting still sent ice through my veins each time. The boy and woman would appear without warning, a blink, and they'd be there, staring across the water. Sometimes he sat alone, small and vulnerable on that bench. Other times she hovered near him like a shadow. Each appearance left me lightheaded with dread, my hands clammy on the steering wheel driving home. I'd given up trying to photograph them or approach, whatever these apparitions were. They followed different laws than our world. Everything shifted on June 18th. I remember it was my younger brother's birthday. because his calls and texts had been lighting up my phone all day, asking where I was. A concrete truck broke down mid-pour, leaving us scrambling until dark to finish before the mix hardened. My head pounded and my back ached as I finally headed to my truck, desperate to escape the sight and the phantoms that haunted it. My drive home took me around the north end of the lake and then east along a newly paved road that would eventually serve as the main entrance to the development. As I rounded the lake, I spotted the boy and woman again, but this time they weren't at the bench. They were walking slowly along the shoreline path, heading east in the same direction I was driving. I slowed my truck, expecting them to vanish as they always did when I got too close. But they remained visible, solid, and substantial in the golden light of the setting sun. The boy was wearing what I could now see was a white button-up shirt and dark blue pants, clothes that seemed oddly formal for a lakeside walk. The woman wore a pale blue dress that fell just below her knees, her brown hair lifting slightly in the breeze. As I drew alongside them, I reduced my speed to barely 10 miles per hour, my curiosity finally overcoming my apprehension. They didn't acknowledge my presence, continuing their slow, deliberate pace along the path. I was close enough now to see their features clearly. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, with a solemn expression that wasn't quite sad, but certainly wasn't cheerful. The boy looked younger than I'd initially thought, maybe 8 or 9, with a serious face that seemed too adult for his small frame. I drove past them, watching in my rearview mirror as they continued their walk. Then the boy's head snapped toward my truck with an unnatural quickness. His eyes locked with mine in the mirror, and his lips moved. The words were unmistakable. "Help me." The woman's grip tightened on his shoulder at that exact moment, her fingers digging in. Her face twisted into something inhuman for just a split second, a flash of rage that wasn't just stern, but malevolent. She wasn't protecting him. She was his captor. I slammed the brakes, tires skidding on loose gravel. When I looked back, the roadside was empty. They hadn't walked away or faded gradually, they'd simply blinked out of existence. I sat there, engine running, knuckles white on the steering wheel, stomach churning. The boy's desperate plea burned in my mind. This wasn't some lost soul wandering aimlessly. This was a child trapped by something sinister. The woman wasn't his mother. She was his jailer in death, as she must have been in life. I almost turned back to search for them, my brother's birthday dinner forgotten. But what could I do? Chase ghosts across an empty construction site? And yet, that plea kept echoing in my head. The terror in the boy's eyes, the woman's possessive grip. He needed help from her, not just from being dead. I missed my brother's dinner. Instead, I drove straight to a bar and downed whiskeys until the bartender cut me off. The alcohol didn't help. The boy's face haunted me through a sleepless night. The next morning, my head splitting, I called in sick. I couldn't face that lake, not yet. Instead, I pulled up property records on my laptop. Nothing useful there. Next, I called an ex-girlfriend who worked at the local news station. She owed me a favor after I rebuilt her deck last summer. I convinced her to let me access their digital archives after hours. That evening, I sat at her desk, searching through crime reports and old stories about the lake property, while she finished editing the evening broadcast. It took most of the day, but I finally found something. A small article from August 1978, tucked away on page 7 of the local paper. A woman named Eleanor Simmons and her son Michael had been reported missing after their car was found abandoned near what was then a logging road running alongside the lake. The article was brief. noting that the woman's husband had reported them missing when they failed to return from a shopping trip to Portland. Local police were investigating, but had few leads. I searched for follow-up articles, but found only one, dated 2 weeks later. The investigation had been transferred to the state police after local authorities exhausted their resources. There was no mention of the case being resolved, no reports of bodies found or the missing persons located alive. The ages fit. Eleanor Simmons had been 34, her son 9. The timing was plausible. 45 years was well within the range of documented hauntings, if you believed in such things. And the location was exact. The abandoned car had been found precisely where the development's main entrance road now ran. What didn't fit was my role in all this. Why would these spirits, if that's what they were, reveal themselves to me? Why would the boy ask me for help? I had no connection to the case, no special skills or knowledge that might resolve whatever had happened to them. I returned to work the next day, unable to share my discoveries with anyone, for fear of ridicule or worse. The sightings continued through the summer, but something had changed. The boy and woman appeared more frequently now, and not always at sunset. Sometimes I'd glimpse them during my lunch break, or while inspecting work on the far side of the lake. They never approached the active construction areas, always maintaining their distance, always vanishing if I or anyone else came too near. But the boy continued to look at me whenever our paths crossed, his eyes finding mine across the water or through the trees. I never saw him mouth words again, but I felt the weight of his gaze, the expectation in his silent observation. In late July, the developer organized a media event to showcase the progress on the first few homes. Local news outlets sent reporters, and the county commissioner made an appearance, praising the project for bringing jobs and tax revenue to the area. During the event, I watched as a photographer positioned the developer and various officials on the shoreline for a publicity shot. The lake and partially constructed homes forming a picturesque backdrop. When the photos appeared in the local paper the next day, I wasn't surprised to see that the boy and woman, who had been clearly visible to me standing at the water's edge during the shoot, were absent from the images. By August, the first 6 homes were nearing completion. The framing was done, roofs were on, and interior work was progressing on schedule. We'd broken ground on the next phase of houses, and the development was taking shape just as the architectural renderings had promised. The lake remained the centerpiece, its waters reflecting the new structures rising around it. The bench where I'd first seen the boy had been replaced with a more elaborate seating area, part of a community gathering space that would eventually include a small dock and pavilion. I wondered if the changes to the landscape would affect the hauntings, if the spirits were somehow tied to specific features of the land that were now being altered or removed. They weren't. If anything, the boy and woman became more visible as the summer progressed into fall. Other workers began to notice them too, though no one spoke openly about what they were seeing. I'd catch someone staring across the lake, their work temporarily forgotten, their expression a mixture of confusion and unease. When they realized I was watching, they'd quickly return to their tasks, avoiding eye contact or conversation. In September, I made a decision. I contacted the state police and inquired about the Simmons case. The officer I spoke with was initially confused. The case was decades old and long since classified as cold. But when I mentioned I was working at a construction site near where the car had been found, his tone changed. He asked me to come to the station. The detective assigned to cold cases was a woman in her 50s, named Sergeant Martinez. She listened patiently as I described finding the newspaper articles. I didn't mention the ghostly sightings, focusing instead on my curiosity about an unsolved disappearance connected to the property where I was working. Martinez pulled the case file, thin and yellowed with age. The investigation had stalled almost immediately, she explained. Eleanor Simmons's husband, Richard, had been the primary suspect. Domestic disappearances almost always involved the spouse, but there had been no evidence to support an arrest. No blood in the car or at their home. No history of domestic violence. No life insurance policies or other financial motives. Richard Simmons had an alibi for the day they vanished, verified by multiple colleagues at the bank where he worked. The case had gone cold within months. Richard Simmons had moved away the following year, eventually remarrying and relocating to Arizona. He'd died in 2011, never knowing what had happened to his wife and son. I asked if the lake had ever been searched. Martinez confirmed it had been, multiple times over the years. Nothing had ever been found. She seemed to be studying me carefully, perhaps wondering why a construction foreman was so interested in a 45-year-old missing persons case. I thanked her for her time and left, no closer to understanding what I was experiencing at the lake. October brought heavy rains that delayed our work and transformed the site into a muddy mess. The lake level rose significantly, flooding parts of the newly landscaped shoreline and threatening the foundations of the homes nearest the water. The developer brought in environmental engineers to assess the situation, and they recommended installing additional drainage systems to manage the unexpected water volume. The excavation for these drainage systems began in late October, focusing on the northeastern shore where the flooding was most severe. 3 days into this work, one of the backhoe operators radioed me in a panic. They'd uncovered something in the soil about 6 feet below the original ground level. I arrived to find him standing pale-faced beside his machine. In the freshly turned earth lay the unmistakable shape of a car, its once metallic surface now reduced to rust and corrosion after decades underground. Even before the forensic team confirmed it hours later, I knew we'd found Eleanor Simmons's missing vehicle, buried deep in what had once been a marshy area of shoreline, but was now solid ground due to decades of natural silting and deliberate landfill by previous property owners. The recovery took a week. The car had been deliberately buried under layers of soil and rocks, hidden from previous searches. Inside were 2 bodies, a woman and a boy. But the forensic report revealed something chilling. The woman wasn't Eleanor Simmons. She was identified as Patricia Winters, Richard's co-worker at the bank. DNA confirmed the boy was Michael Simmons. The truth emerged in fragments. Richard Simmons hadn't just been having an affair with Patricia. They had planned to start a new life together. But Eleanor had discovered their relationship and threatened to take everything in the divorce, including full custody of Michael. The plan had been for Patricia to take Eleanor out of the picture. Then she and Richard would raise Michael together. But something went wrong. The sedatives Patricia gave Eleanor didn't work as planned. Eleanor never got in the car. Instead, Patricia took Michael, possibly to use as leverage. The police found Patricia's diary hidden in the car's spare tire well, somehow preserved in a waterproof bag. The final entry described Michael witnessing something he shouldn't have and threatening to tell his father what Aunt Patty did to Mommy. Patricia wrote that the boy couldn't be trusted anymore and she needed to fix the situation. Eleanor's body was never found. Construction at Lakewood Heights was halted for nearly 3 months during the investigation and subsequent media frenzy. The developer considered abandoning the project entirely, fearing the property would be forever tainted by its association with the murders. But by February, work had resumed, albeit with a more subdued marketing approach that emphasized the natural beauty of the area rather than its peaceful seclusion. I still work at the site, overseeing the completion of homes that will soon be occupied by families unaware or unconcerned about the tragedy that occurred there decades ago. The lake remains the centerpiece of the development, its waters calm and reflective on clear days. The boy and woman no longer appear on its shores. Whatever kept them bound to this place seems to have been resolved by the discovery of their bodies and the revelation of the truth about their deaths. Sometimes I find myself looking for them out of habit, scanning the shoreline or the bench where I first saw the boy sitting alone. But the only figures I see now are construction workers, landscapers, and occasionally prospective homebuyers touring the property. The Blueprint Man. From Anonymous. You ever think about whether you've possibly run across a serial killer without even knowing it? They're not so common these days, modern stats would have you believe. But I think it still happens, because I believe it happened to me. We were building an addition to a local existing hospital. Big project, 5 stories with 2 wings connecting to the main building. The frame was about halfway done when this guy started to show up. He just appeared one day in March. Tall, really skinny guy wearing a white button-down shirt that was way too clean for construction. He always carried this blue tube, the kind architects use for blueprints. He'd walk around the site perimeter, taking notes in a little black book. One of our guys asked if he was an inspector. I had no clue. Nobody told us about any inspections scheduled. The weird part was he never wore a hard hat, never checked in at the site office either, and he never talked to any of us. Instead, he seemed to just watch. One of the newer guys was suspicious too. "That guy doesn't look at the building. He looks at us," he said during lunch one day. I told the new guy to leave it alone. But the next day I saw him walk up to the guy near the east stairwell. I was working on the 3rd floor. Couldn't hear what they said, but I saw the new guy trying to be friendly. The tall man just smiled. Not a normal smile at all. Then turned and walked away. Later on, the new guy told me. He didn't say a word, just stared at me like he was memorizing my face. The tall man didn't show up for a couple of days after that. Then the new guy started to miss work, didn't even call in. That wasn't like him. When he missed a second day, we called his emergency contact, which was his sister. She called back that evening in tears. The new guy was dead. Someone had cut his throat. I was called to the new guy's apartment to identify some of his stuff. What I saw there still keeps me up at night. The walls were covered with blueprints, not professional ones. Hand-drawn sketches of the hospital mixed with floor plans of houses. Our houses. My kitchen window was drawn perfectly, even showing the crack in the corner I hadn't yet fixed. A detective showed me some security footage from the site. The tall man was careful to avoid most cameras, but one caught him looking right at it, with that same empty smile the new guy had mentioned. The detective explained. He's a former patient at this same hospital. Had some kind of breakdown after his wife died during a routine operation. Blamed the doctors, the hospital, everything. When I asked why he had targeted one of my workers, the detective replied, "You're expanding the place where he lost everything. In his mind, I think you're helping them kill more people." They found detailed plans in the new guy's apartment showing how the man was going to sabotage critical structures to the building so that it would eventually collapse after opening. I wonder if our new guy had interrupted what he was doing that day, and he wasn't happy about that. There was a massive manhunt for weeks afterward. Construction was halted, and eventually started again with police guards. We checked and rechecked everything during the build. Didn't find any tampering, thankfully. Never found the tall man either. Since then, I've heard stories from 3 other construction sites in the area. Workers talking about seeing a tall guy with a blueprint tube hanging around at dusk. Last month, a carpenter from another medical building project didn't show up for work. They found drawings in his garage. Not of the building he was working on, but of the next healthcare facility planned for the region. The cops never officially connected these cases. The detective who handled the new guy's murder retired, and new officers don't seem too concerned about the blueprint man. But we are. Every construction crew warns each other. If you see him watching, you're already in danger. I've installed security cameras and motion sensors at my house. Sometimes I wake up at night, thinking I hear someone outside. The worst part is nobody believes there's a connection, except those of us who have seen him. He leaves no evidence except those detailed drawings, and the dead who are found. I keep track of every rumored sighting, and every unexplained disappearance in the construction around here. There's definitely a pattern, but it's too spread out for the authorities to truly care. Today's stories were a bit more wild than usual, but I think they were quite chilling. The werewolf one might be one of my recent favorites, in fact. That Paranormal Witness episode is infamous to me personally. The first time I saw it, I swear I stayed up a little too long that night, unable to sleep. If you haven't seen Paranormal Witness, go look it up and enjoy. Thank me later. That brings us to the end of this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on Twitter at DarkPrevails. And above all else, go get my new book pre-ordered right now. I'll put a link in the description. Or you can go on Amazon and look up Creepy Campfire Stories by Darkness Prevails. It features an absolutely disturbing and terrifying selection of outdoor-related horror stories in a gorgeous hardcover book, complete with eerie and atmospheric illustrations and images. It releases July 8, 2025, and I'm trying to get 2,500 pre-orders before then. If we can get that many, I will personally send you every coffee bean I have right now. Just kidding, I need those to survive. If you do pre-order, seriously, thank you so much. It's super helpful, and it tells the publisher that my writing and our books are worth publishing. Until next time, everyone, I'll be back on the clock again real soon, but for now I'm gonna clock out, because my voice is so dry and awful. That's why this episode's a little bit shorter than usual. I keep choking. So I'm gonna down some throat coat and listen to some Oni plays, and I'll see you all again real soon.